In this news roundup of the week for Friday the 3rd of June 2022. Shanghai emerges from lockdown, but the zero COVID policy is putting doubt over Xi Jinping's status as dictator for life. President Biden U-turns with dizzying speed on sending long-range missiles to Ukraine. American Republicans signal a shift to being more positive on climate change. And in this week's Short Thought, I talk about the choice we make about whether or not to use polarising language. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. This week saw Shanghai citizens finally being released from a harshly stringent lockdown as cases of Omicron infections after weeks of isolation reduced to a handful of cases. So you'd think that everyone would be happy and everything would be back to normal. Well, not exactly. Certainly in the early stages of release, people were deliriously happy by all reports, as you might expect. However, various protests have happened since then, and there's not much doubt that the harshness of the regime has shocked and deeply affected a lot of people, and the mood music is reportedly growing that this shows every possibility of kicking back against Xi Jinping himself. Xi is, after all, the one who is insisting that zero COVID is the only possible policy, in spite of numerous academics briefly saying it's no longer tenable until, of course, they inevitably get censored. And the impact of the Shanghai lockdown and the other similarly strict lockdowns in other parts of the country has been to put the Chinese economy under serious stress. The Shanghai situation is reported to be considered to have been a disaster. Badly organised, often brutal enforcement that was widely shared on social media, where even the censors have struggled to contain it. Investment banks have slashed their forecast for China. For example, UBS was predicting only slightly more than half of what Beijing itself said it's planning for growth this year. Add to that last week's exposure of documents and photos from Uyghur internment camps, and things have not been going tremendously well. This has led to all sorts of signs of discontent, sometimes in surprising places. So Xi's premier, Li Keqiang, has become extremely blunt in public about the economic cost of recent policies, making very little effort to defend them. Indeed, on Wednesday this week, he held a meeting between China's cabinet and more than 100,000 officials from all levels of government. Li Keqiang urged them all to take action in sustaining jobs and reducing unemployment, warning in very stark terms how bad things have gotten. The authorities unveiled 33 new economic measures, including increasing tax refunds and extending loans to all sorts of small businesses. And if all of that sounds to you a little like desperation, I can't say I would disagree with you on that. If you would really want to get a sense of how it stands, you just have to reflect on the fact that this week Xi Jinping banned grumbling inside the Communist Party, because that's always a sign that everything's going so well. Particularly retired officials, the ones with not so much to lose, presumably, they must not discuss policies and decisions in an irresponsible manner. What constitutes an irresponsible manner? Well, they must resolutely resist and oppose all kinds of wrong thinking. This move has been provoked, no doubt, by the growing rumour mill that has been predicting that Xi will be forced out within days, or that Xi has been diagnosed with a brain aneurysm and is refusing surgery, or that Xi's declining public appearance reflects fading power, and so on and so on. Such speculations are usually, according to Chinese watchers, a sign of simmering grievances within the CPP, which of course can't be openly disclosed or discussed. So instead, discontented officials push the rumours out to Chinese news outlets overseas, where they get amplified and then come back into China. There's also some evidence of discontent over China's support for Russia in the Ukraine conflict, believing that Russia's atrocities against civilians taint China by association. Various figures have made comments such as a former Chinese ambassador to Ukraine and a number of academics. Their comments online, of course, are quickly removed and they are encouraged to remain silent. But clearly it's a significant, even if it's a minority complaint. All this matters because Xi Jinping is soon to have his next 5-year term approved. Indeed, until recently, it had been taken completely for granted that power for life was his for the asking. There are many who hold that that remains the case, and that he is quite simply the most powerful Chinese leader since Chairman Mao. But certainly, whether it's because part of a much larger hidden wave of discontent is surging, or alternatively a small surface ripple of wishful thinking, there are plenty who are seeking to make a big focus on the moment to ask if it's really the best thing for China that Xi should get another 5 years. The thing is, for Xi Jinping, it's likely things are going to get significantly worse before they get better. Based on experience elsewhere, bringing Shanghai out of its brutal lockdown when even just a handful of Omicron cases are still out there, seems kind of likely that there will be another surge. I mean, maybe a smaller one, maybe a less powerful one, maybe. But even in that scenario, which is the sort of thing our society's just decided to tolerate, that is not acceptable without breaking the zero COVID policy. And what's more, the national capital, Beijing, has started to see cases creeping up over the last few weeks. 7 districts there have been put under partial lockdown, affecting nearly 14 million residents. Seems pretty unlikely that will just naturally and easily begin to recede of its own accord. So does Beijing come next? And can Xi Jinping survive if it goes full Shanghai? And even if he does, which is probably still the most likely outcome, it may well mean that a number of his rivals, with the support of Li Keqiang, will be stronger in the next administration than they are right now. And who knows how that plays out. There are not a lot of potential successors in sight, as you might expect when everyone had been thinking that there'd be no vacancy for at least a decade or more. But at the very least, that might begin to change in the short term, even if it's not visible from the outside. Speaking of things changing in the short term, and in this case I mean the very short term, on Monday, President Biden announced that the United States would not provide Ukraine with rocket systems that had the range to be able to strike into Russia. And this created something of a backlash with, for example, one former US ambassador to Russia saying that it was wrong to be, quote, sitting in Washington and trying to calculate what we want Ukrainians to do on the battlefield. But then on Wednesday, the White House announced that it would send $700 million worth more weapons to Ukraine, including those long-range weapons, a U-turn so rapid it practically left you giddy. The US said that Russia had brought this on itself, which sounds a bit like scolding a naughty child rather than dealing with the most serious matters of war. Specifically, Ukraine will be receiving M142 high-mobility rocket systems, which will more than double Ukraine's artillery range and allow it to hit targets up to 50 miles away. At the same time, Britain will be sending its M270B1 multiple launch system, which can destroy targets as far away as 43 miles. How quickly these will be able to make any sort of difference on the battlefield is an open question. Russia is actively engaged with disrupting such supply chains, as you can imagine, and the Pentagon said that the rocket launchers would take a minimum of 3 weeks training to be able to operate. The offer came after, reportedly, Ukraine had given America assurances that the missiles would not be used to hit targets inside Russia itself. Well, that demand didn't sufficiently gladden any hearts in Moscow by all accounts, and Russia responded strongly to the announcement, saying that America was, quote, adding fuel to the fire deliberately, and saying that it had increased the risk that America would be drawn directly into the conflict. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said America wanted to fight Russia to the very last Ukrainian. The move comes at a time when the turn of the fighting has continued to shift against Ukraine, with its forces under heavy bombardment, including, of course, from long-range weapons from Russia. The American system, while having a range that's slightly less than Russia's Smerch rocket launcher, is nevertheless more highly mobile and better able to hit multiple targets in quick succession. It would be particularly effective in hitting Russian supply lines further back than currently possible. Not everyone has been signing up, however, to the arms donation bonanza. Switzerland vetoed a proposal from Denmark to send Swiss-made Piranha-free infantry fighting vehicles due to its policy of neutrality. And Germany's Olaf Scholz has been under a huge amount of fire. So on Wednesday, he repeatedly refused to say whether or not he wanted Ukraine to win the war. This was as he was announcing that Berlin would, after much criticism for promising and not delivering, that it would finally provide Ukraine with anti-aircraft weapons. There has been growing criticism of Scholz and French President Macron's decision to hold phone conversations with Vladimir Putin. The Wall Street Journal quoted a senior Czech official saying that the move was destroying EU unity on Ukraine. Every phone call, ministers from the north of Europe and Central Europe are getting more and more angry. It's precisely what Putin wants and what the French and Germans are giving him. Meanwhile, having said that it would lift the blockade on Ukraine's grain harvest if and only if the West removed sanctions, Russia upped the pressure in that area by using some of those long-range missiles to destroy a strategically vital bridge. There was a key alternative route for grain to get out, albeit in smaller quantities. This activity is unlikely to be halted or diminished by the fact that the head of the African Union is to speak to President Putin today to try to free up the stocks of cereals and fertilizers. As you know, Africa, along with the Middle East, is the key destination for a lot of the Ukrainian produce. Well, if Putin does agree to those requests, it won't be because the demand for lifting sanctions has been met. Rather than considering lifting them, the EU this week concluded its rather tortuous negotiations to increase them with a partial oil ban. But various countries made clear that this process has now hit a political hard limit. So those countries pushing for more energy sanctions, particularly to start including gas supplies, and those are Poland, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, they were told that just isn't going to happen. Austria and Germany particularly ruled this out. Karl Nehammer, the Austrian Chancellor, said that it would be out of the question because of the effect on major European economies. Russian oil is much easier to compensate for. Gas is completely different, which is why a gas embargo will not be an issue in the next sanctions package. I can't say it's entirely clear that such sanctions have more than a fraction of the effect that people think they do. Because in theory, the partial ban means a loss of €7 billion a month for Russia. But that income is likely to be replaced by soaring prices and strong demand in Asia. Now, speaking of bans, Joe Biden was invoking again this week the idea of an assault weapons ban. Not going to spend time on that here because it's just a signal for the two sides to rehearse the same arguments they always do. Such a ban is politically impossible, as he acknowledged even as he was calling for it. But to be fair, some apparently politically impossible things do turn out to be possible after all. So this week, Republicans seem to be in the process of shifting gears, at least partly, on climate change. House Republicans launched a 6-part strategy this week, the outcome of an energy, climate and conservation task force created by Kevin McCarthy last year. The aim was to come up with distinct Republican policies that go on the offensive on climate change and energy policy to try to snatch the initiative away from what they see as Democrats' left-wing agenda on the issue. It was a recognition that many in the centre ground of the party, and particularly amongst the younger groups coming into the party, do not believe that the issue should be avoided and ignored. The task force report has 6 pillars, with titles designed to appeal to mainstream American voters rather than specifically to environmentalists. Things like Unlock America's Resources, Beat China and Russia, Let America Build, Build Resilient Communities, American innovation and conservation with a purpose. The aim is to promote private sector innovation to curb emissions without specifically setting emissions reduction targets and without specifically targeting fossil fuels. The aim would be to promote domestic production of energy on an everything including the kitchen sink basis, including oil and gas, wind and solar, small modular nuclear, hydrogen and carbon capture. They would want to reduce the obstacles to energy infrastructure of all types, renewables as well as pipelines, LNG terminals and mines to produce critical materials. The chair of the task force, Representative Garrett Graves, told the Politico website, "Are we open to looking at strategies that nudge technologies to economic sustainability? Yes, but a lot of that can be achieved through R&D partnering with innovators." The question will be whether the shift from Trump's out-and-out skepticism on the topic to this new recognition of the issue, but still pushing fossil fuels as a major part of the energy mix, whether that's enough of a shift to get credit from the voters that they're targeting. Obviously, you would expect the Democrats and the environmentalists to pour scorn on the plan, and so they did. Representative Don Bayer was quoted by the Washington Post. "I welcome the efforts of anyone, regardless of party, who is willing to seriously tackle climate change. But this does not look like a serious proposal. Most people understand that a serious climate solution requires a shift towards cleaner sources of energy, but the Republicans apparently want to take us in the opposite direction with more dependence on dangerous, dirty energy sources." The move is a reflection of what the party believes is needed to perform well in certain crucial swing states in the November midterm elections. George David Banks, a former White House climate advisor under President Trump, said this: "It's the competitive seats that make the difference, and most of those run through the suburbs, so there's certainly a recognition that you've got to win a critical mass of those to control the House." Republicans also said that should they win the House in November, they will reactivate investigations into the relationship between hostile foreign governments and the activists who oppose American energy production. They argue that what they describe as anti-energy campaigns undercut America's geopolitical standing while benefiting strategic competitors, namely China and Russia. They want to probe foreign influence over the campaign groups, as well as the litigation they promote targeting US oil and gas projects. With all of this, it now seems Republicans are now positioning themselves as the pragmatic counterpoint to Democratic strategies that are hostile to fossil fuels in all contexts on a moral level and prone to exaggeration and excessive fear-mongering. It's a position that has a real moment of possibility, with the rhetoric of the Democrats having gone to the extreme, but that's then contrasted by the failure of the Biden administration to actually get policies passed. That said, it's not at all obvious this version is going to fly. For one thing, its attempt to play well in the oil-producing states has kept it so far away from the centre ground of the issue that it's likely the Democrat attacks on it will be able to be effective when it comes to those younger voters at least. Secondly, how much it becomes the position of the party rather depends on who becomes the candidate for 2024. It's perfectly possible Trump could decide to endorse it, because, the issue isn't one he cares that much about. And if a particular position would be politically advantageous and his party was firmly behind it, he'd probably swing at least part way in line. But more likely he won't. The Trump base doesn't care about the issue, believes it's all made up by the other side, and Trump probably cares more about his base than he does the House Republicans. That said, it could well be that the reason why the plan is so friendly in principle to the oil-producing interests in the country is to come up with something that Trump himself could support. Time will tell, but the fact that the party felt the need to do this launch at this time tells you something about the signals they're getting on the ground. There was a study last month that noted how jackdaws take to the skies all at once, and this is triggered when the noise of them calling out collectively reaches a certain volume. It was reported in rather odd terms, labelling this as the crows making a democratic decision, which is anthropomorphism, the process of attributing human traits to animals, at its finest. It was also noted that pesky researchers could artificially mimic the cacophony and trick the birds into taking flight when they wanted. You could take that as a parallel, not with democracy, but how easy to manipulate are large groups of people. The problem is that just as there are researchers who seem to be taking the time to work out how to manipulate crows, there are rather more in the political space who have been spending time working through how to manipulate human beings. It starts with the language of politics, where issues are framed in terms of moral absolutes that divide by design. For example, how are you going to achieve nuance in a discussion, for instance, about abortion, when it's expressed in terms of, on the one hand, killing babies, and I sure don't want to do that, or women being denied control of their own bodies. Well, I don't want to do that either. But whereas in more innocent times, you then engage in a nuanced discussion where you're forced to confront the difficult questions about, well, what constitutes a life? What does it mean to take a human life? At what point does it become something we legislate? If any compromise is morally grey, where do we as a society draw that delicate line? You don't get any of that with this language. You get two moral absolutes that have no connection with each other at any level. And so you just scream slogans at each other, demonise each other. Even if one side temporarily gains the upper hand, you will never ever reach a conclusion. That's where our society is right now. But it's a choice that you make about how you succumb to it. It starts with the language you use. It's up to you whether you follow others in describing issues in morally absolute and emotional language. It's up to you whether you label people with derogatory terms that they wouldn't own for themselves. That language is all a tool of manipulation. It's up to you whether you define yourself as someone who uses language to describe, to communicate, to think through ideas, to connect with people, or someone who uses language to manipulate. If you do it yourself, you can't really complain when politicians and others do it to you. It's all in the language you use. And the good thing about this is you can practice every single day, refusing to perpetuate the divisive tones of our political discourse. The more you do it, the better you get at it. The more you do it, the more easily you spot the people who, whether they intend to or not, whether they're just following the norms of their tribe, are trying nevertheless to do it to you. All right. I've been realising the last few weeks that I need to make a change on this channel. A while ago, I committed to producing 3 videos per week. It's been a lot. Along with the small amounts of client work I have to do to fill in the gaps, it's meant working 7 days a week, most weeks. And even with that, some of the production gets rushed, and the sort of things I could be doing elsewhere that might help to promote the channel don't get done. All that time gets into making the videos, which would be fine if that was making headway with the YouTube algorithm, but it's not really. My instinct was that the content I produce that you most value are the deep dive videos where I explore a topic in some detail, and the end of a week news roundup and comment, this video. I checked that instinct with my Patreon supporters and it was confirmed. I mean, it wasn't even close, in fact. So as a standard, I am dropping the number of videos I do to 2 per week, with an emphasis on the deep dives and the Friday news roundup. I will still do a monthly Q&A video inviting Patreon supporters mostly to give their questions. I will not be doing live streams. They tend to be the least valued, and I don't think the kind of content I do suits them especially. However, we should go out with a bang, so next Wednesday will be the very last of the live streams, at least for the time being. So do come along to that and join me to mark the moment and to throw whatever questions and comments you have to me in real time for the last time. The hope is that the reduction in the volume will enable me to sharpen up the quality that little bit more and to enable a bit more promotion to help the channel to grow. Hopefully you will agree that's worth a try and you will continue to give your valued support. And speaking of valued support, that segues nicely into thanking the good people on Patreon who make all of this possible. Without the income from patrons, I would be mostly spending my time on client work and maybe managing to do 1 video, 2 videos per month. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, my name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show, and to mark the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, I thought we should go out with a rendition of the national anthem. I'm kidding! Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.